Okay, we'll get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Really appreciate you making the time to attend our event. My name is Mohammed Ayyash, increasingly going by my original Arabic name, Mohammed Ayyash. I was born and raised in Silwan, Palestine, before immigrating to Canada at the age of 14. I am a professor of sociology at Mount Royal University and chair of the Calgary Peace Prize. I've been chair of the Peace Prize since 2016, and I'm very proud of all of the work that we've done over the years, and certainly very proud of the work that we've done this year to honor our esteemed recipient of the 2023 Calgary Peace Prize, Mohammed El-Kurd. We're so delighted to have you and all of our speakers here today, and thank you all for attending. The Calgary Peace Prize used to actually be an in-person event. Since the pandemic, we switched to an online event, and we kind of stuck with that because we're able to reach a wider audience this way. So for the foreseeable future, I think we'll stay as a virtual event. So I know that we have people attending this event today from all over the world, and I'm really thankful for that. I myself, I am speaking to you today from what is now called the city of Calgary. The Blackfoot name for this place is Mohkinstis, which means the place where the Elbow and the Bow River meet. This was a meeting place for the indigenous peoples of these lands. These lands are the homelands of the Niitsitapi, the Blackfoot, and the people of the Treaty 7 region in what is today called Southern Alberta. And that includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, Tsuut'ina, and the Îyârhe Nakoda nations. It is also home to Métis Nation Region 3. And I stress here the point that it is their homelands. I use that word on purpose. To me, it's not that important what the Canadian state or what international law deems to be a truly officially sovereign people or a sovereign state. For me, these have always been the homelands of these indigenous nations, and forever will be their homelands. And they are a sovereign people living sovereignly on their lands. And I hope to do my small part in whatever way that I can, whether it's through my teaching or my writing or in my everyday life, to stand side by side with indigenous peoples and nations to realize the resurgence of indigenous sovereignty on these lands, as it should be. And I hope that you, as our audience members, will also do the same in your own capacities and in your own life. I won't speak for long now. I'll come back on later when we begin with our panel discussion. For now, I want to ask a long-serving member of the Calgary Peace Prize Committee, Karen Huggins, to come on and introduce our recipient for the 2023 Calgary Peace Prize, Mohammed El-Kurd. Karen has been a stalwart in the peace activist community in Calgary for a very long time, and it's been my honor to work alongside her all these years. So Karen, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you, Mark, and good morning, everybody. The 2023 Calgary Peace Prize will honor Mohammed El-Kurd for his exemplary contribution toward peace and justice in the struggle for a more humane, dignified, and free life for oppressed people in Palestine and beyond. Through his already world-renowned and still burgeoning literary and activist career, El-Kurd inspires people to follow truth and justice and act on the local and global levels to achieve the goal of human rights and freedom for all, creating a more peaceful and just world. El-Kurd is an internationally touring and award-winning poet, writer, journalist, and organizer from Jerusalem, occupied Palestine. In 2021, he was named as one of the 100 most influential people in the world by Time magazine. Time states that along with his sister, Muna El-Kurd, Mohammed provided the world with a window into living under occupation in East Jerusalem this spring, 2021, helping to prompt an international shift in rhetoric in regard to Israel and Palestine. He is well known for his role as a co-founder of the Save Sheikh Jarrah movement. In their interview with El-Kurd, Jewish Currents describes this campaign. In October 2020, the Israeli Magistrate Court of Jerusalem, a fixture of its apartheid legal system, ruled that half of the Palestinian families in the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah would be dispossessed of their homes. Among them was the family of writer and activist Mohammed El-Kurd. When the ruling came down, Mohammed, who is now 23 years old, joined his sister Muna and other community members to mount the Save Sheikh Jarrah campaign, which broadcast the conditions of Palestinian life under occupation and galvanized support for his resistance against settler land theft. In fact, Israeli settlers had already seized half of El-Kurd's home in 2009. They did this with the backing of the Israeli military and through Israeli courts. They were among 180 Palestinian families facing dispossession and expulsion from their lands and homes in the Palestinian neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. Palestinians in other neighborhoods are still facing this threat of expulsion today. El-Kurd's work has been featured in numerous international outlets, and he has appeared repeatedly as a commentator on major TV networks such as CNN, BBC, and MSNBC. Currently, El-Kurd serves as the first ever Palestine correspondent for The Nation. His first published essay in this role, A Night with Palestine's Defenders of the Mountain, was shortlisted for the 2022 One World Media Print Award. Rivka, his debut collection of poetry, was published by Haymarket Books in October 2021 and was later released in Italian by Fandango Libre. Rivka was named a masterpiece by the New Arab and a remarkable debut by the Los Angeles Review of Books. It was one of Middle East Eye's best books of 2021 and was shortlisted for the 2022 Forward Prize for Best First Collection. In the foreword to the book, Aja Monet writes, "May these poems challenge you. May they shake you into action. May they help you find the words for what you already know to be true." In her endorsement of the book, Hala Alyan writes, "Rivka is an absolute marvel, and El-Kurd is precisely the kind of poet, Palestinian or otherwise, we need right now, unafraid of the truth." El-Kurd holds an MFA in creative writing from Brooklyn College and a BFA in writing from Atlanta's Savannah College of Art and Design. He is the recipient of numerous honors and medals, including the Arab American Civil Council's Truth in Media Award in 2022, as well as the Cultural Freedom Fellowship from the Lannan Foundation in 2023. He is currently a Civic Media Fellow at the Annenberg Innovation Lab at the University of Southern California. El-Kurd has lectured and performed around the world, including as the keynote for the 18th annual Edward Said Memorial Lecture at Princeton University, at the Internazionale Literary Festival in Ferrara, Italy, and recently at the Adelaide Writers' Week in Australia. It is my great honor to introduce Mohammed El-Kurd, recipient of this year's Calgary Peace Prize.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Karen, for that delightful introduction. It's an honor to be here. And I can't believe I'm already getting a Peace Prize. I thought you needed to like bomb the shit out of some place to get those, but alas, overachiever. But really, I'm very, very excited to be here. I'm thankful to Mohammed and for the entirety of the Peace Prize committee for picking me. Thank you, God. Thank you, Adderall, etc. But I'm not going to do an acceptance speech. I'd rather talk a little bit about something more important than just, you know, my own gratefulness or my own feelings about this. I want to talk about peace. Peace almost feels like a dirty word, right? Growing up in Palestine, peace has always felt like a muddied, tainted word with which we were taunted as Palestinians for decades and decades, for as long as we have resisted the very forces that robbed us of our peace, that have displaced us, that have taken our homes, that have stolen our lands, that have killed our parents and grandparents. I've heard it and I continue to hear it. Growing up, from diplomats to journalists, Israeli officials with American accents. You hear it on the news, you hear it on TV, you hear it from the Human Rights Watch field researcher who's drinking coffee in your living room. You hear that word all the time, and you are almost always accused of being reluctant to be peaceful. You're almost accused of not wanting to live in peace. It's almost like they dig their daggers in our lands, in our backs, and they twist their daggers, and then they ask us, why don't you want peace? They kill our parents, they steal our homes, and they ask us, why don't you want peace? And this leads me to my focal point, which I'm sure you already know what I'm going to say. There can be no peace without justice. And that's really all we want as the Palestinian people. Those of us who write, those of us who throw stones, those of us who are resistance fighters, those of us who sing, those of us who are engaged in the cultural realm, those of us who are doing policy, those of us who are hounding diplomats. We want justice. I can do the played out quote by Martin Luther King and say that a riot is the language of the unheard. But really, if you come to Palestine and you see people burning tires in the ground, people throwing rocks at illegal checkpoints and settlements, people chanting for their freedom, these are people who are anxious and eager for peace, for security, for a security that means a security that doesn't have to mean owning nukes and rockets and bombing people and having shoot to kill policies. Not that kind of security, a security in which there are no refugees, a security in which there are no prisons, a security in which everybody has access to food and shelter and protection, a security in which everybody has access to dignity and human life. Today in Jerusalem, it's a big day for us Jerusalemites. There's the infamous flag march. It's a racist settler march in which settlers celebrate the so-called unification of Jerusalem, which happened after the 1967 occupation of the eastern part of Jerusalem, as well as the West Bank. They march in the thousands under protection of police, soldiers, and secret services inside the walls of the occupied old city, as Palestinian shop and business owners are forced to close down their shops, as Palestinian residents of the city are forced to stay at home. They march and they yell racist things, and oftentimes this march is advertised as the fringe far-right march. But I would argue it's not really that fringe. It's quite literally the sentiment that reflects the policies that we have been living under. And this is a very marketable march. When I tweet about it, when I write about it, it gets hits online. It makes noise. People are shocked to hear settlers with Brooklyn accents say death to Arabs. People are shocked to hear this kind of obscene language in our neighborhoods, in our streets, and people are quick to condemn it. It's almost the same as when now the Israeli finance minister Bezalel Smotrich said that the Palestinian people did not exist. And even the fiercest of the advocates for the Israeli states condemned him for saying that. But I want to take my time here to kind of challenge that notion and challenge our understanding of violence, our understanding of peace, our understanding of justice, because the violence we live under does not have to be spectacular in order for it to matter. And it does not have to be so venomous and coming out of the mouths of teenagers who are just spitting slurs. It is happening in the now, in the form of policies and laws that are enacted, in the form of the status quo that is eating away at our lands, in which the entirety of the international community, including and especially Canada, is complicit in. So if you'll allow me, I just want to tell you an anecdote that's quite similar to the things that have been happening here around this event. In October of last year, I was invited to deliver a talk on Black Palestinian solidarity at the Harvard Kennedy School. And in the days before that talk, there were protests from Zionists, there were angry emails being sent, there were news items that were spreading all kinds of defamation against me from the very famous Apartheid Defense League, the ADL, what they call themselves, the Anti-Defamation League. And it was happening so rapidly. And then the day of the event, there was a bomb threat to the Harvard. Both Cambridge and Harvard police received bomb threats. And, you know, it wasn't my first rodeo, so I wasn't surprised. You know, this happens all the time. Somebody makes a mysterious claim, there's going to be a shooting, there's going to be a bomb, there's going to be a blah, blah, blah. And it's usually, in my opinion, a scare tactic meant to stifle Palestinian advocacy. Very similar to what's been happening around this event in the past weeks. And I'm very, very grateful to be able to receive this prize today, and that we have gone on with this event and have not bowed our heads to this kind of intimidation tactic, this kind of smear campaigns. But anyway, during that event that I did at Harvard, a student asked me the million-dollar question, whether I supported violence committed by Palestinian activists, whether I was willing to condemn violence committed by Palestinian activists. Obviously, I gave him an answer that he was not very pleased with. But as soon as I got off that stage, I learned that during the event, Israeli soldiers had killed 6 Palestinian men in a massive raid of the occupied West Bank that left dozens and dozens wounded. And in that year, you know, according to the people that keep tabs, this has been the deadliest year for Palestinians in the West Bank. Some of these men that were killed in the raid were men who are engaged in the Lion's Den, a group that has claimed responsibility for various operations targeting Israeli occupation forces that are illegally occupying the West Bank, you know, similar to the people, to the Ukrainian people we praise in Western media. Anyway, and when I talk about the Lion's Den, or when I talk about resistance fighter, when I talk about violence and peace and so on, my instinct as a writer who writes in English is to offer context, explaining why a group of men would want to take up arms against their occupiers, why a group of children would want to throw stones at tanks. But in the past year or so, I've learned that in the English-speaking world, we don't need context to justify resistance to occupations, so long as the occupiers are not Israeli, of course. You know, questioning my sentiment on violence as a person who's been displaced, as a person whose entire community is on the line, as a person, you know, considering everything, considering the facts on the ground, may seem ironic. But it is not just ironic, it's deceptive. These smear campaigns are deceptive. They're a glaring red herring. And while they can be comical sometimes, for example, you know, sometimes I get at my talks Israeli soldiers who blindfold children for 3 years, and then they want to reprimand me about not being polite enough. For when, you know, you go to CNN and there's an Afrikaner, hilariously an Afrikaner TV reporter asking me whether I support violent protests, as CNN broadcast videos of my family being harassed and beaten by settlers and soldiers. But at that moment, when I was asked that question, and then I realized that 6 men had been killed by the Israeli military, I realized that there are 2 worlds. There is the world of the brutal military occupation in which we live, in which these martyrs lived, and the world as imagined by the students and the diplomats and the journalists that ask me these kinds of questions, the people who make these smear campaigns. Those students, these TV anchors, those diplomats, those observers everywhere are not only unconcerned with the root cause for our rebellions having stared down the barrel for over 7 decades, they're also unfazed by the violence inflicted on us. Our death is mundane in their eyes. It doesn't make the headlines, it's business as usual. At the very best, killing us is a necessary evil. But my point about the flag march, about the spectacular rhetoric, is that even if they didn't kill us, even if they didn't say the quiet part out loud, even if they did not routinely bombard the Gaza Strip, the occupation is still violent. It's still aggressive to live under occupation, to be kept in an open air prison. Even if there was not an open air prison, there are Palestinians here in the West Bank that have gone their entire lives smelling the humidity of the sea, but never having the opportunity to go visit, one of the Mediterranean's beautiful beaches. Isn't that within itself a violent act? And in what world would resisting that kind of deprivation be condemnable? You know, usually I prefer to focus on reporting what's going on the ground, but I wanted to address this today because it's apt. I think it's on theme when we're talking about peace and we're talking about violence. Because today in Canada and the United States and the UK, Palestinian political activism and even national sentiment or anti-colonial sentiment are so censored that activists always find themselves fighting baseless accusations, find themselves on the defense in the corner, instead of organizing. Because there are salaried adults who take themselves way too seriously, making it their mission to harass and stalk university students, to harass and stalk activists that are not institutionally backed. And this is not random, this is by design. I mean, the former Director General of the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which is now part of the Foreign Affairs Ministry, called it waging a holistic campaign on the other side, taking him out of his comfort zone, making him be on the defensive. They turn us into criminals of thought, guilty of our rage and grudges, of our natural responses to brutalization, censored and put on trial. You can obviously tell I'm reading from a script. No. Anyway, yet, you know, those people that clutch their pearls at resistance, those people who clutch their pearls at fury, at anger, at tweets, praise it when white people commit it, or when, you know, to be more accurate, when it's committed by people that do not threaten their regional interests. In recent months, you know, a New York Post headline hailed a Ukrainian suicide bomber as heroic, right? I watched that and I thought I was having a psychotic episode. I read a New York Times article in which a Ukrainian doctor advised that hate is a natural and healthy reaction to occupation. I read that and I was shocked that people, as long as they're not Palestinian, are allowed to have natural reactions to violence, are allowed to have natural reactions to subjugation, to settler colonialism, to occupation. In the Western mind, violence seems to be this constantly mutating concept. It's normalized when it's state-sanctioned, formalized, and done by men and women in uniform. Shoot to kill policies, administrative detention without charge or trial, land theft are often legal and always done according to protocol. And even if they violate international law, most of the time they don't violate Israeli law. I'm talking about military barriers, color-coded legal statuses, cement walls splitting families apart. And not only are they justifiable, but they receive billions and billions of dollars in Canadian dollars, because this is Canada, in aid every year. So I don't want to take my time here trying to convince anyone of our humanity or anyone of our right to resist. You can see me, I have my eyes, my nose, my limbs. I'm human right before you. I don't need to convince you, and I don't need to convince the people of the history of colonialism of our right to resist, or of how much we crave peace and how much we crave security. Those of us who are resisting, those of us on the ground, those who are born and raised in violence, they don't require the approval of Ivy League students or right-wing websites. They don't require the approval of snobbish TV broadcasters or corporate television anchors who routinely turn a blind eye to the decades of debilitating systemic and material violence of the Israeli regime, of the Zionist regime. So when I'm asked whether I believe in violence, I often say I don't believe in violation. I want to end with one thing. I think it's quite remarkable that someone as impolite as me is receiving this award. Someone as menacing as me is receiving this award. I think so many of us as of late feel that they can no longer keep up this respectability charade, feel that they can no longer perform an ethnocentric standard of humanity in order for our pain, in order for our right to defend ourselves to be taken seriously by Western audiences. So many of us are refusing this framework that has forced us for decades to parade our trauma, to travel far and wide with PowerPoints in our backpacks, trying to convince racist diplomats and politicians of a right to live, of a right to peace, of a right to resistance, of a right to defend ourselves, of a right to security and dignity. That part was fully freestyled. I think it was quite good. Anyway, thank you so much for having me. I hope this was not more than 20-25 minutes. Thank you so much for having me today. Thank you, Mohammed, especially thank you, Karen, Yara, Desmond, Erica, and Ronaldo. It's such an honor to be here. It's my first Peace Prize. So I would thank my parents, but they didn't have much to do with it.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. That was wonderful. Did we? No, sorry. That was really wonderful, Mohammed. Thank you so much for that. As we'll see in our discussion, the very first question, you've already answered some of it, but politeness is not a prerequisite for peace and justice, and it is difficult to imagine politeness in a context such as the one that the Palestinians suffer. It is now my absolute pleasure to moderate this panel that we have set up here. We have a list of amazing speakers here that really need no introduction. But I'm going to go ahead and try to make this brief. It could take a long time if I introduce everyone with their full bio. That would just take up too much time. So I'll try to be brief here and introduce all of our 4 panelists, and we have a list of questions to go over for the next approximately 1 hour and 20 minutes. So I'll do it by alphabetical order, and perhaps as I introduce you, please turn on your camera. First, we have Desmond Cole. Desmond Cole is a journalist, radio host, and activist in Toronto. His debut book, The Skin We're In, won the Toronto Book Award and was a finalist for the Forest Reading Evergreen Award and the Rakuten Kobo Emerging Writer Prize. It was also named a Best Book of 2020 by the Globe and Mail, Now Magazine, CBC, Quill and Choir, and Indigo. Cole's writing has appeared in the Toronto Star, Toronto Life, The Walrus, and the Ottawa Citizen, among others. Of note also is his work with the Black Lives Matter movement and his successful effort to remove the Toronto Police presence from TDSB schools, the Toronto District School Board. Desmond has also worked to address housing, social support, integration, civic engagement, and justice for youth. Thank you so much for joining us, Desmond. Next is Yara Hawari. Yara is the senior analyst of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. She completed her PhD in Middle East politics at the University of Exeter, where she taught various undergraduate courses and continues to be an honorary research fellow. In addition to her academic work, which focused on Indigenous studies and oral history, she is a frequent political commentator writing for various media outlets, including The Guardian, Foreign Policy, and Al Jazeera English. Based in Ramallah, she frequently documents and reports on the violences committed by Israeli occupation forces in Palestine. Her book, The Stone House, was the New Arab Book of the Year in 2021. Welcome, Yara. Next, I will introduce Erica Violet Lee. Erica is a Nehio, Plains Cree author, poet, community organizer, artist, and scholar. Erica has worked with Idle No More, the Canadian Youth Climate Coalition, and the David Suzuki Foundation, among others, in the pursuit of Indigenous feminist freedoms. She is from Westside, Saskatoon, and Thunderchild Cree Nation in Saskatchewan. She's a 2-time CBC Future 40 winner, a YWCA Youth Award recipient, a previous member of the Canadian Youth Delegation to the United Nations COP21 Climate Conference, as well as a board member of Indigenous Climate Action. Thank you for coming, Erica. Welcome to the panel. And last but not least, we have Ronaldo Walcott. Ronaldo is a professor and chair of Africana and American Studies at the University of Buffalo. His research is in the area of Black diaspora cultural studies, gender and sexuality, with interests in nations, nationalisms, multiculturalism, policy, and education broadly defined. As an interdisciplinary Black studies scholar, Walcott has published in a wide range of venues on everything from literature to film, to theater, to music, to policy. In 2021, Walcott published The Long Emancipation, Moving Towards Black Freedom, and On Property, Policing, Prisons, and the Call for Abolition, which was nominated for the Heritage Toronto Book Award, longlisted for the Toronto Book Awards, a Globe and Mail Book of the Year, and listed in CBC Books Best Canadian Nonfiction of 2021. Welcome, Ronaldo. Thank you for coming. It is my absolute pleasure to moderate this wonderful panel. And I just want to note that this is the largest audience we've ever had for the Calgary Peace Prize. So I'm really delighted, whether it was in person or virtual. So I'm really delighted and thankful for everyone who attended today. So I have about 5 questions, general questions that I'll ask each of the panelists to answer. And so let's get into it. And the first one really is speaking a lot to what Mohammed talked about in his presentation. So if we go back to 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King was very clear that the civil rights movement and the peace movement against the war on Vietnam were interlinked and really constituted one struggle. And in a famous quote, he said, and I quote, "There can be no justice without peace, and there can be no peace without justice," end quote. The slogan, "No justice, no peace," became popularized in and through the Black liberation struggle from the 1980s onwards. Now, within mainstream discourse, the reason I bring this up is because within mainstream discourse in Canada and the US and elsewhere, as Mohammed really captured very well in his presentation, the word peace is often cleansed of justice. People seem to think that peace necessarily means being non-confrontational, polite, to the point where this mainstream notion of peace no longer even names status quo power relations as the major part of the problem and as the greatest barrier to a just peace, which it is. So, for example, and this happens in all kinds of contexts, but in the context that Mohammed writes about, I mean, very few will have the courage to put the matter as Mohammed truthfully puts it in his book, Rifka, and I quote, "Colonialism in Jerusalem killed the peace," end quote. So can you each please speak to the importance of justice in the struggle for peace? What is for you a just peace in the context of Black, Indigenous, and Palestinian struggles? And I want to start with Ronaldo here on the Black struggle for liberation specifically, because Ronaldo, in your book, The Long Emancipation, you talk a lot about how true liberation, freedom, and justice lie outside of state structures. And I have a brief quote here from your book. "I define freedom as ways of being human in the world that exist beyond the realm of the juridical and that allow for bodily sovereignty," end quote. So in our discussion here of a just peace, we're certainly not restricted to state notions of peace. So we'll start with Ronaldo, and I'll call on the others as we go through the speakers. Ronaldo, please.
Yes. First of all, congratulations, Mohammed. And thank you for that wonderful talk. I'm coming to you from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy territory, which some of you might know as 6 Nations today. This kind of question of peace, the question of peace, the invocation of MLK around no justice, no peace, is always haunted by the emptied out rhetoric of nonviolence. So when we think about peace, at least in this part of the world that most of us are in today, the emptied out rhetoric of nonviolence leaves aside a significant element of that dynamic, which is the question of self-defense. So when we talk about bodily autonomy, when we talk about maybe even the sovereignty of the body, we are forced to ask ourselves, so what kind of risk, what kind of price are we willing to pay for that? And that brings us to the kind of the equation between peace and self-defense. So on the question of thinking about confrontation, the question of confrontation is the question of violence. When and at what point and when is violence useful and necessary? And of course, I come to answering this question through the work of Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, of course, where Fanon writes of the cleansing nature of violence in the colonial situation. But also the minute that I invoked self-defense was my trace to Malcolm X, right? In which Malcolm X was very clear in articulating a position that violence in service of self-defense was not only legitimate, but made absolute intelligible sense. So the kind of question then of how we think about a kind of larger structure of peace outside and beyond the state has been something that has been of particular interest to me for a long time. But I would say, and I'm going to use some language and I'll hint to figures who we no longer reference as immediately as we should, because they themselves became susceptible to particular elements of the state, and therefore made state politics and statecraft particularly problematic. But I'm old enough to begin to notice politics in a moment when there was still something called the non-aligned movement. And the non-aligned movement was not necessarily a peace movement, nor was it necessarily a movement in which the state did not play a significant role. But what it did do, it offered a counter response to how Euro-American forms of peace, and this is what I would say, there are many forms of peace get to shape how colonized people respond to the violence being enacted on them. And so for me, the question is never simply one of a peace that somehow is marinated in something called nonviolence, but the question is, how should we respond to our suffering? And when our suffering is conceived and executed through forms of violence, do we have the right to respond to that violence with violence? And of course, my answer to that is yes. It's the only intelligent answer.
Thank you so much for that, Ronaldo. Yara.
Apologies if my voice is not so understandable. I'm a bit sick, but I hope you'll be able to comprehend me through the nasalness. In Mohammed's speech, he mentioned that peace has become such a dirty word in Palestine, and I think that's the case in other areas in the world, because it's often been used to pacify or to repress those struggling for justice. And if we look at Palestinian history specifically, we can see how this was done time and time again, namely with what we call the peace process. So mainstream narratives in the West view the Oslo Accords of the early 1990s as this culmination of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. And it was this great big success story that then subsequently failed. And Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres, and Yasser Arafat, they all received the Nobel Peace Prize for signing these accords, which was a complete farce. At the time, Palestinian scholar Edward Said wrote that it was the Palestinian Versailles, basically a signing of Palestinian capitulation. I think this really sums up what kind of peace this was and continues to be for Palestinians, a complete capitulation. I mean, what else can you call an agreement which forces the Palestinians to acquiesce to the loss of over 80% of their homeland, the loss of access to all the major water and natural resources, and to forego any kind of sovereignty for a facade of autonomy? This is not peace. And when you have an entire population placed at the mercy of another, and when you have a placated population, that is not peace. It's definitely not peace for the Palestinians. So even today, with the elephant in the room, that is the failure of Oslo, people still talk about peace for Israelis and Palestinians. And when it's spoken about, it's usually spoken about at the expense of Palestinian rights. So when Palestinians resist against Israeli regime violence and colonial policies, they're accused of disturbing the peace. But the latter never faces such an accusation. The Israeli regime has never ever been accused of disturbing the peace for 75 years for inflicting a horrific structure of settler colonialism on the Palestinian people. And the same really goes for all these, peace and dialogue initiatives that we see take place in Palestine and really pushed forward by the donor community. It's this ridiculous idea that, contact and dialogue are the way to end this so-called violence. And what it does is it creates this false parallel between the structural oppression of the Israeli regime, the Israeli settler colonial regime, and the justified resistance of the oppressed Palestinians. So it places Israelis and Palestinians on this binary. And so that's why, certainly for me, and I know for many other Palestinians, we're very suspicious of those who talk about peace in this context, because there is yet to be a peace discourse that centers the oppressed and legitimizes their resistance, and that doesn't want to maintain the status quo of Israeli apartheid and settler colonialism. And I have to say, even those who don't have nefarious intentions, they really fall into the trap of this kind of peace talk. So I would say that we desperately need to steer away from these kinds of narratives, and we need to shift the discourse away from that peace to that of justice. Palestinians, those that are facing occupation, settler colonial expansion, they need justice. And justice includes, and is not limited to, the repatriation of our lives and lands to our homeland, reparations, compensations, and many other things. All of those things you never hear about when people talk about peace.
Thank you so much, Yara, for that incredibly succinct and critical context for our audience to listen to. Erica.
Hanse Erica Valina Tsikason, Misesquitominik Iguapiaseo Asis Nito Tsen. Can everyone hear me all right? Awesome. So, Mohammed, congratulations. This is awesome. I'm so glad to know your work. I'm so glad to be here at the same time as you. What you said in your opening remarks was really powerful. And I think your voice is so strong while being effortlessly genuine. And I really respect that. I think it's very difficult for a young person to be upheld as a symbol of resistance. It's difficult to maintain your selfhood and your self-esteem and all of those little individual things that you sort of have to put on the back burner when you become sort of like the face of a struggle, right? Because that's what they want. They want us to be individual faces of a struggle rather than like a community member. And you always bring it back to the community. So I really respect that. And I'm honored to be here for you. I have a little poem that I think is appropriate in this context. It's called On the Politeness of Canadians. How old is this country? 1867, 1885, 1982, 1996, 2021, and 215. The answer is not as old as Nookham's stories. These small, gentle languages we've been taught to use as polite names for their hatred. So let us tear away the veneer of their civilization. Let us say genocide. Let us say abolition. Let us demand abolition. Demand abolition. Say it's breakable. Say it's broken. Say this must be broken. Say it was built this way. So let's put away our civilized tongues and sing it loud. Empire must break. I love that you brought up the idea of respectability because it's so exhausting. It's exhausting on your soul to be constantly held to the standard of peace, of politeness, when you're being murdered, while your family are being murdered, while you're enduring all of this violence, and we have to be graceful about it. And I think that really aiming toward liberation means just saying fuck that and saying what you said straightforward. This is what's happening to us. And I refuse to be polite about it because you're not being polite you're not treating me like a human being. You're not treating me like a person. You're not treating me like a creature worthy of love in the way that you treat my people, in the way that you treat my loved ones, the people that I know, the people that I'll never meet, but that I'm in solidarity with. So I think the words justice, the word peace, the word decolonization, the word violence, all of these things are so insufficient for where our discussions are at this point. And I find more and more, it's just like the limitations of colonial language. From what I know of Palestinian poetry and Palestinian discourse, there's just so much richness there that can't be captured by English. So I also want to hold space for that. And yeah, I agree with everything that Desmond and Yara and Ronaldo have said. Oh no, sorry, Desmond didn't talk yet, but I totally agree with him. Yeah, it's just we're being so limited and caged in by these languages, by these concepts that are not meant to serve us. And you really talk back to that, Mohammed. So thank you.
Thank you for that, for those powerful remarks, Erica. Well, let's hear from Desmond.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. Congratulations. It's really an honor to be with you and with my friends on this panel. Thank you for your writing, and thank you for, as Erica said, like shrugging off respectability. Just a quick correction about my bio. Somebody put a bio out there about me a couple of years ago, which I really have to get off the internet, because it gives me credit in part. It says that I helped to lead the fight to get cops out of schools. I was there, but I've written a lot about that. I was one of thousands of people. I didn't do it. I didn't lead it. I wasn't one of the main activists on the ground. So I'll get that bio off so that people stop citing it one of these days when I remember. Anyhow, Mohammed, you said in your opening portion that the violence that we live under does not have to be spectacular to matter. And I really appreciate this. And it really rung like a bell inside of me when you said this, because I feel like the spectacular obscures the mundane when it comes to the violence. It is so easy, right, for people who see the spectacular, the outrageous, the mask off forms of violence to look at that and say, well, I don't agree with that. Well, I condemn that. But the structure of everyday violence that is actually what supports and keeps everything moving does not have to be addressed in those contexts. So I think it's just always so important to be reframing and to be reminding people of what violence is, the scope of what violence is, which is not usually spectacular. It is not usually death, but it is the everyday, not just physical even forms of violence, the psychological control and containment of colonized people, the narratives of racism. These two are violence. And so thank you for your poetry. Thank you for your writing. Continue. We have your back. We love you and we support you. When it comes to this idea of justice and peace, I often think about Dionne Brand. I'm going to quote her because in a talk some years ago, Dionne Brand said, "I do not write towards anything called justice, but against tyranny and toward liberation." And she goes on to expand in this talk that really the notion of violence for her, or sorry, the notion of justice for her is itself questionable. What do we mean justice? Because in our system in Canada, for example, we talk about a criminal justice system, and people who know the folly of even that term call it a criminal injustice system. But what would justice look like here? I don't even know if we're at a place where we can talk about that yet. When I go to demonstrations, sometimes we chant "no justice, no peace." But as I'm thinking about this conversation, I almost think that while I still chant that, I definitely accept Dion Brand's idea about the problem of justice. And it's almost, when we say no justice, no peace, we're not saying something prescriptive. We're almost describing, we're being descriptive that there is neither of these things. There's neither justice nor peace. And that maybe we can't and don't need to begin formulating what peace is or what justice is until the racism and the settler colonial violence and the oppression stops. Because I don't know how we can do all of these things at once. I don't know how we can juggle and try to formulate the ideal when what is creating these conditions is ongoing. So maybe that's what I would say for now on this idea that we're not at a place where we can talk about either justice or peace. We can only talk about fighting towards liberation, fighting against settler colonial violence, fighting against racism and all other forms of oppression, and getting to a space where once we have reduced the great weight of these violences, then maybe we can begin to conceive peace. But I think everybody has said really beautifully here that these words, they have only an imaginary meaning at best in the context of what's happening in the world.
Thank you so much for that, Desmond. And we'll certainly come back to that very important point about the road towards liberation at the end of our discussion. Mohammed.
First of all, thank you all for the very, very kind words. I'm not usually, I don't know how to deal with such sincerity, so thank you. I think everybody has answered this question beautifully, and Yara has laid out the groundwork in terms of talking about justice in Palestine. So I want to just focus on one element of what Yara mentioned towards the end, which is the necessary materiality of that justice, right? Justice is not just some metaphor, some poetic line. It's not just a flowery word. It has to exist in the real world. As Yara said, it has to be in the form of reparations, in the form of giving land back, in the form of freeing political prisoners, in the form of having all of these refugees return to their original homes, in the form of having people visit the beach for a time before they die. You know what I mean? I feel like academics and civic media professionals want to decolonize everything except land. It's quite boring. I think we have such a narrow approach to justice. In the past, I'm quite young, so like in the years that I've been alive, the approach to justice has been quite narrow. Like me being on Time 100 most influential list, when there has been hundreds of thousands of people that led the Sheikh Jarrah campaign in 2021. Even this Peace Prize, I mean, I'm incredibly grateful for it. It's certainly great optics. I get to have a Peace Prize. But again, it's symbolic. And I think since everybody has spoken about the role of the state, the role of the judiciary, the role of geopolitics in justice or in the lack of justice, I want to maybe speak a little bit about us and about our responsibility as civic media actors, as cultural knowledge producers, as academics and journalists. How are we advancing justice? How are we advancing liberatory politics? What does a land acknowledgement do if we don't know any indigenous person, if we're not engaged in any kind of indigenous struggle? What does it mean that I get to receive an award? I was going to say this in my speech, but it would have been very predictable. But what does it mean for me to receive an award when today there are people in Jerusalem that have gotten beaten and arrested by the Israeli police for defending the Jerusalem's occupied old city against the racist flag march? What does it mean that I get to, go from one university to another? How am I? And I certainly believe in my own work, but I think we have to have this kind of critical lens that is rooted in the material reality so that we're helping others. I think, sure, getting death threats or having bad press about me is certainly like difficult to deal with sometimes. But if I took all of that and I went with it to the refugee camp here in Ramallah, to Al-Amari, and I told them, look, they're saying bullshit about me, they would tell me to, go home and, to get a hobby, because people are dealing with real material violence. And so our approach to justice needs to be real and material at the same time. And I'm always grappling with that question. I'm always wondering if what I'm doing is good enough. And obviously none of you here is my therapist, and nobody in the audience member, though I am looking for a therapist. But this is not to, to get affirmation. This is just to say it's important to have this kind of critical lens on one's work. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Mohammed. And if I may just link a point there that you said to something that Desmond said, and I apologize for the mistake I made in introducing you there, Desmond. But it is critical to understand that in all struggles, it is always the countless nameless people. They're not nameless, but whose names that we will never hear or learn about, who drive these struggles. It's never just one person, and it certainly takes a collective to achieve change, and that's always critical to underscore. And maybe we'll stick with you here, Mohammed, for the second question, because it's kind of related to some of your comments that you just made. One of your obviously there's so many amazing lines to pick from, but one of the lines that really stuck with me from Rifka. It's from the poem, and I quote the name of the poem here, Boy Sells Gum at Kalandia. For those who don't know, Kalandia is a major checkpoint that dehumanizes and brutalizes thousands of Palestinians on a daily basis. So I quote a line from that poem. A woman tells him a pen is a sword. What's a pen to a rifle? Another fed him a sonnet. If Shakespeare was from here, he wouldn't be writing, end quote. So my second question is, how do you each see the role of art in the struggle towards this just peace and this liberation, but in a context that is saturated with colonial violence? In other words, as Mohammed puts it beautifully, what's a pen to a rifle? So Mohammed, if you could speak to that, please.
Absolutely, yeah. What's a pen to a rifle? I often make a joke, and I'm sorry if you've read it somewhere before. I've really played out this joke, but I often say a joke that if I were to go stand in front of the Qalandia military barrier, and if I were to recite a poem in front of that the barrier is not going to erupt in flames. It's not going to catch fire. It's not going to crumble. My words are not going to do anything. So what do words do, right? Like, that is my question always. What does cultural production do for the advancement of the liberation of the Palestinian people specifically? And obviously there is that, big brushstroke of an answer about like how shifting cultural sentiment means you shift public opinion, means you shift policy, and means you shift the future. But even more so, and even more empowering, I think, is what cultural production can do for the oppressed, not just for those who want to be allies of the oppressed. And if you will allow me very briefly, I want to quote from one of my favorite poems of all time. I know you all know Mahmoud Darwish, but a poet that doesn't get much credit is Rashid Hussain. He's my absolute favorite poet. One second, let me pull up. I very quickly translated this, so it's kind of a horrible translation, but Rashid Hussain first read this poem, this very sarcastic poem, in the Organization of Arab Farmers Conference in Akka, in protest of the 1960 Israeli land law, which classified 93% of the lands in historic Palestine as quote-unquote state-owned. And the poem also references the 1950 absentee property law, which allowed the Israeli government to arrogate the properties of Palestinian refugees displaced during the Nakba. This very sarcastic, sardonic poem is called God is a Refugee. He says, God has become a refugee, sir. Confiscate, therefore, even the carpet of the mosque. Sell the church, for it is his property, and sell the town crier in the black auction. Extinguish the wicks of the stars, for they will light up the lost traveler's path. Even our orphans, their father is absent. Confiscate our orphans, sir. You have liberated even the grazing cattle. the day you gave Abraham Muhammad's field, the horses roaming free at the mountaintops, descent to become yours, most civilized sir. The land reads you peace. Its wheat is gratitude gathered in a lake of gold. Did you not liberate its necks from the plowman as the bull gloated before the hay feeders? And then he ends the poem by saying, where is this land? Its soil is fire. How did you bear its flames? Where did you get this wheat? How did you steal it? Its seeds from our congealed tears. If I were to squeeze your bread in my hand, I would see my blood leaking from it onto my hand. And here Rashid Hussain was able to translate and bypass the bureaucracy of this law and translate it to the people that matter the most, the landowners, the farmers, the people who have cared for this land for generations and generations. And this poem, among many, many other things, as we have said, it's many factors accumulating, but this poem was one of the things that fueled the masses to do the land strike, to rise up against these racist laws. And I think that is the role of writing, and that is the role of cultural production. Otherwise, it's just theater. Otherwise, it's just self-indulgent. And sorry, that was a really long answer, but yeah.
No, absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much, and reminds me a lot of what Frantz Fanon has said about the role of the cultural production in the anti-colonial struggle. Thank you, Erica.
That's heavy. That's yeah, that really hit me. Your poem, Mohammed. That line. What's a pen to a rifle? I think about this all the time. If Shakespeare was from here, he wouldn't be writing. To be a poet and a writer in your situation, what a silly, flippant term for what we go through. But to be a poet and a writer and want to like create something beautiful in the face of constant, like the constant shit we deal with as oppressed people, as colonized people they're trying to colonize still actively, to create something in the face of so much destruction wrought upon us is the best kind of life. And I wouldn't trade that resistance for anything. And I think you really nailed it when you said it's not about convincing people. And I think for the longest time growing up, I thought if I can become as like good of a writer as possible, if I can get all these degrees, if I can like prove that I've spoken at whatever universities and like say like my language is just as good as yours and I've mastered it. And so maybe now like I'll win something for my people, I'll win something for like my loved ones, but that's not what it's about. It's about what are we doing, what are we creating for each other, and what are we doing to support each other in the mundane, the daily mundane, right? So thank you for the poetry. And I think I love that, just that response, because it's so disarming to them to not only know their language so well, but then to refuse it and play with it and mess around with it and make it into something even more beautiful than it was to start with.
Thank you so much for that, Erica. And that's a really critical point on that convincing point. I remember one time someone told me that if my academic journal article was less passionate, it would convince more people. First of all, most people would not find it passionate at all. We'd be like dry and boring and unreadable, but I refuse to change it, of course. Thank you for that. Desmond.
I write in a mostly journalistic capacity now, but I started writing a journal, like actual journal for myself when I was a little kid. And I think for me, that's where this starts. It's the practice, there's something about the practice of telling stories to yourself, documenting and capturing and reflecting on the things around you. I never wanted to share my writing with other people, and I didn't actually really do that until I started being in my 20s, late 20s, where I really actually started publishing things for other people. But most of my writing has been for myself at first. And so I think a lot about this in terms of exploration, experimentation, play. And sometimes I go back to old things that I've written and can't believe it was me. Wonder what kind of a state that I was in to be expressing myself in the way that I did. So I think that there's a kind of form of revelation, self-revelation for art that is, like, for me, actually really also very important. But often when I write something that's for the world, I have this insecurity. What are people going to think about this? Are people going to care? I often think, like, big thing is like, why is anybody but me going to care about this thing that I'm focusing in on, of all the things that I could write and reflect and talk about? But I guess, yeah, for me, there's a very deeply personal aspect that is about, like, self-validation, maybe I'll put it that way, that says that the inner anxieties and fears and joys and excitements and responses that I have in the world are worth putting down, even if nobody else sees them, because they validate me. They give me a way of reflecting on my own experience and saying that it is important. And then, yes, of course, when I read something that somebody else has written, or a play or a piece of music, it is a very intimate, I think, form of connection first before the political. When somebody says something in hip hop or in dance that connects with me, like, spiritually and emotionally, I think that that is an unlocking that can lead to the political, that can lead to, like, broader forms of, but that's not necessarily the point of it. It's like a deeply intimate one-to-one, and the one can even be the self, me to myself.
Thank you for that, Desmond. I really appreciate you sharing that personal, intimate aspect of this question. Really appreciate that. Yara.
I think this question touches on a lot of our I think it's a tough question because it touches at a lot of our feelings of sort of imposter syndrome, maybe our uselessness as writers in a liberation struggle. But, you know, if I zoom out and think about the bigger picture, there are always different aspects to a liberation struggle: armed struggle, popular mobilization, art, political maneuverings, you know, and all these different aspects hold their own weight and importance in a struggle. And that goes for the people involved. You know, everyone has their place and can contribute in different and important ways. But at the same time, I think it's important that we don't separate and compartmentalize these forms of resistance in the struggle. But by that, I mean that, you know, they're connected. They don't exist on their own. And to insist that they do, I think sometimes, or more often than not, is an effort to depoliticize. So, you know, for example, I personally don't think it's enough, and this is speaking from, you know, a background of writing in academia. I don't think it's enough to produce critical research on Palestine or publish critical op-eds. I think we have to be involved in political organizing on the ground, either in Palestine or in exile, wherever we may be. And if we look at, you know, many historically revolutionary contexts, the boundaries between scholarship, between writing and revolutionaries was always blurred. You know, and an obvious example is Frantz Fanon, which Mohammed just mentioned, who is so often referenced in scholarship on colonialism and settler colonialism. for his brilliant analysis on the colonial condition. But Fanon was also an active member of the Algerian National Liberation Front, and much of his writing intersected thought and practice, offering this, really fantastic revolutionary praxis. Because for Fanon, the intellectual and the revolutionary were not mutually exclusive terms; they were these complementary roles. And similarly, in the 1960s, there was this cohort of Palestinian scholars who were producing scholarship from the PLO Research Center, including Sabri Jarias and Fayez Sayer. And for these scholars and many others, liberation, revolution, and knowledge production was understood to be intimately connected. So to answer the question about the pen and the rifle, I think both coexist, or rather co-resist. And separating them is often part of this dangerous ploy to depoliticize people's struggle for liberation.
Thank you so much, Yara. And that is a critical point of how those things are, the cultural aspect is interconnected, intersects with other aspects of the struggle. Thank you for that. Ronaldo.
Yeah, for fear of repeating much of what my colleagues have said already, I guess one thing that I would add to the conversation, focusing on the cultural realm, thinking about visual art, film, poetry, is the kind of work, I think Desmond call it intimacy, I call it interiority, the kind of work that cultural production does in both securing and exploring the interiority of our lives, often in colonial ongoing colonization. Our lives are so often reduced only to the material effect that poetry and art is able to return us to a certain kind of sometimes coherent interiority. And that's because I think artists are able to use languages of the past, the present, and even the future to offer us new imaginaries, to offer us new ways of thinking about what might be possible. But I think particularly in this historical moment that we're living in, where there's so many struggles around what things actually mean or could mean, that art and cultural production also offers us, riffing off of something Desmond said, ways into the possibility of new formations of community. So for me, I think, you've got the exemplary figures like Fanon, Aimé Césaire, and so on. But then you've got lesser known, at least globally, but known within art worlds, of thinkers like, for instance, a Kamal Brathwaite, writing poetry, a historian, but writing poetry out of the Caribbean, whose radical work was to rejoin Black people not only to an imagined and lost Africa, but to the geographies that they now inhabited. And so for me, cultural work, art, poetry, the best of it is in some ways does some important reparative work that exceeds, a lot of the ways in which we can become consumed by the material effects of our own victimization. And what that work does is it recognizes that, it pushes back against that, it gives us languages for apprehending that and for struggling with it, but it also gives us another kind of bedrock to imagine what future possibilities might look like, what forms of community we want to build and imagine, and so on.
Thank you for that, Ronaldo. It's a really critical point for people to think to really think about the role of art in reimagining our current situation and our future potentialities and where we want to go. And to me, actually, this question is linked on the role of art with the next one, where I want to shift our attention here to the question of intersectionality. If I may speak a little bit from my personal experience, when I first moved to Canada, one of my favorite groups to listen to was Mobb Deep. And I remember watching their video, Hell on Earth, and seeing footage from the Intifada in it, which it took me really by surprise. I was like, how the heck do they know about the Intifada here in New York, like, or in Canada, and they're showing it in video, and I didn't quite understand it all that well. But when I visited Queensbridge, where Mohammed is from, in 2019, I didn't need to think about that question. I understood very well why it is that they showed footage from the first Intifada in that video. So let's dig into that question of intersectionality. Erica, in a CBC First Person piece from 2021, when you were discussing the interconnections between Indigenous and Black struggles in Canada, you wrote, and I quote, "We do not live on our own. We do not write on our own. Our movements are ancient and they are entangled. I want to move through the world in a way that acknowledges Black women as the originators of so much freedom work without reducing our existences as Black and Native women to a harmful and impossible comparative study. I think we need to be careful with each other. We cannot lie saying we live on our own. We cannot pretend to write on our own. Our movements cannot flourish on their own," end quote. Now, I'm sure our audience here hears a lot these days about the intersectionality of struggles and debates about what an ethical solidarity across our shared struggles looks like. There is, of course, a very long and ongoing history and story of solidarities between Palestinian, Indigenous, and Black struggles for liberation. So perhaps you can each speak to how you understand this intersectionality. So a little bit about how, what makes these struggles intersectional, but more importantly, how have you experienced this solidarity across these struggles? And perhaps you can speak to that point about your experience with solidarity. You can speak to that with an eye towards what you think an ethical solidarity is and should be. So we'll start with Erica.
From a younger age, even the term intersectionality doesn't suffice for me, or in the academic context, interdisciplinarity is the trendy thing now, and ultimately you kind of have to, I think, get rid of those distinctions entirely. We're not, and become anti-disciplinary. We're not ever only one struggle, right? We're the amalgamation and the living, breathing, constant shifting of all of the histories that come together in us. It took, I understood colonialism, I understood decolonization, I understood colonialism as a Native kid growing up in inner city Saskatoon, but the piece that I was missing the whole time, I think, was recognizing anti-Blackness, because it's so central to everything that we're talking about here. And I think that a lot of people who aren't in the Black communities are afraid of talking about it. And oh, that's not my role or whatever. And it's actually it is our role, because confronting white supremacy is all of our work. Confronting colonialism and the history that we all benefit from in some way or another of anti-Blackness, the presence of anti-Blackness, that's our work. So for me, I never think of it as separate. It's not separate from my struggle as or my life as a Native person, right? That's the people I love, and that's what I choose to do. And I can't imagine living another way. I think, and also not speaking for another person is important, and not speaking our experiences are identical, they're parallel, but they're never the same. And remembering that is important as well. But also, people get really caught up, I think, on siloing struggle. And so I guess that's the power of intersectionality, but then moving beyond that and recognizing there's no borders between us. And yeah, just respecting each other's voices. It's like pretty simple once you think of it in terms of relationality.
Thank you, Erica. Yes, I think key words for everyone to remember there: parallel but not identical, relationality, respect. Thank you for that. Ronaldo.
Yeah, I began by invoking the non-aligned movement for a particular reason. It was to kind of hint at, a rather imperfect but nonetheless important model on example of how our peoples have been encountering each other for a really long time, even prior to the post-colonial movement that gives rise to something like the non-aligned movement, which is to say that, we've been meeting in the colonizers' capitals, 150 years. And to use the language that Erica just used, and experiencing and dialoguing and debating our relationality, the difference but similarities of the forms of colonial oppression that we have encountered. But inside of that also, our peoples have been making communities so that, how we think about indigeneity or how we think about Palestine, the Black Palestinian, the Black indigenous, and so on. So that the idea that, these are peoples who have no links and must discover each other, to use that kind of colonial language, is a fiction in and of itself. So the kind of question for me, and I'm very much with Erica, for me, the question is not one of intersectionality, but it does hearken to the question of the ethics, of the ethical. What kind of world do we imagine? And what kinds of conversations and encounters must we pay attention to, because they're happening whether or not we're paying attention to them, through which we begin to conceive of what forms of community are possible, what ways of relating to each other become possible. And so for me, the kind of question of why do our struggles sometimes line up and sometimes they come apart is because exactly how we approach that question of relationality. And sometimes we're really good at approaching it, and other times we fail miserably at it. But the point is that we have to take risks in entering into conversation and dialogue. And in taking that risk, we also have to take the risk to hear each other, and hear each other for deep differences, our complicities, and also pointing towards something else, pointing towards something like liberation, like freedom. And so for me, the kind of question of how our various movements line up is one about us taking the political risk to hear each other in really deep, solid, searing ways.
Thank you so much for that, Ronaldo. And that is a critical point, that idea of risk and being open to and not being defensive with each other on our complicities, as you put it. That's a really critical point. Yara.
Well, I think we often think of intersectional struggle in very contemporary terms. And I think particularly because of the terminology and the language around intersectionality, we might be tempted to think, or people might be tempted to think, that this is something new. But of course, this type of solidarity, one that transcends class, gender, race, nationalities, etc., and understands structures of oppression in a multi-layered way, has a long history, particularly in anti-colonial struggles, as Ronaldo mentioned. We didn't just recently discover each other. Amilcar Cabral, the Pan-Africanist revolutionary, once said that Muslims make the pilgrimage to Mecca, Christians to the Vatican, and the national liberation movements to Algiers. And indeed, after liberation from French settler colonialism, Algeria opened its doors to revolutionaries around the world, including the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And I think this was a period that really embodied the spirit of intersectionality and intersectional solidarity. And it was one that was understood more in internationalist terms. And importantly, anti-colonial struggle was at the heart of this. Now, a lot has happened since then. You know, revolutionary connections weakened, especially with the onset of neoliberalism and policies of de-development, which, you know, have forced the depoliticization of civil societies and the grassroots around the world. Specifically to Palestine, there was this distinct narrative shift that began this process of depoliticization and the breaking of these internationalist ties, namely the Oslo Accords. And I bash the Oslo Accords a lot, but that's because they deserve it. But they framed the Israel settler colonial project as an issue of these two conflicting national movements that would find peace within a two-state paradigm. And what we saw happen, because the PLO accepted this paradigm, we saw a revolutionary movement shift its discourse and its policies from liberation and anti-colonialism to that of state building in the West Bank and Gaza. So this inevitably led to the breaking of ties with a lot of people and communities in the global South and anti-colonial movements. And in particular, Palestinians turned their attention to the agendas of the donors, which were predominantly coming from the US and from Europe. But more recently, I would say in the last decade or so, we have seen a revival or resurgence of intersectional struggle and internationalism. And I think it's important to note that Palestinians in the diaspora are playing a crucial role in this. You know, half of the Palestinian people are in exile. They are spread all across the globe. And even though, you know, their exile is not voluntary, they're also positioned wonderfully to create all these connections. And indeed, at, you know, the height of Black Lives Matter, we saw a huge amount of solidarity work between Black communities and Palestinians organizing together. I believe there were delegations from the US to Palestine, BDS campaigns, etc. And even part and parcel of the BLM manifesto was the liberation of the Palestinian people. And similarly, we've also seen increasingly Palestinians show up for indigenous movements in the US and vice versa, you know, recognizing, of course, similar and sometimes overlapping structures of oppression. And I think, you know, if we're to move across the pond, which, you know, in the UK, which I'm more familiar with, there's also been a lot of cross-movement organizing, and specifically around a whole host of repressive legislation that the Conservative government is bringing in with regards to protests and boycotts. And, you know, this is obviously directed at the Palestinian boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, the BDS movement, which attempts to hold the Israeli regime accountable through boycotts and divestment. And the situation in the UK is actually really quite bad. And a lot of comrades are calling it a plunge towards a police state reality. And this isn't simply to do with Palestine and Palestinian solidarity. This, you know, covers all types of protests. Just to give you an example, there's this Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, the PCSC, which expands and extends the powers of the police and other institutional authorities massively. It's a massive overreach of political power, and it's a very obvious attempt to suppress protests. It gives police officers, you know, the really broad discretion to deem protests illegal, to charge and to arrest attendees and organizers. A protest can be deemed illegal simply if it makes too much noise. Anyone can be arrested and charged for organizing or sharing information about protests. So these, you know, legislative maneuvers are really attempting to attack all different types of marginalized groups and communities and political movements. But the mobilization against them has also been, you know, incredibly cross-sectional, and it's been led by a massive coalition of allies, including those struggling for Palestinian liberation. And I'll end on this, you know, what Palestinian comrades are doing, and that they're insisting that Palestine is not this niche issue. You know, it's at the core of progressive and radical leftist politics, you know, and it's almost become a litmus test of one's politics. So many radical groups and those on the left will support all kinds of liberation struggles and social justice issues, but will not touch Palestine with a barge pole. And I think that tells you a lot about someone's politics. And sorry that my voice was going.
No, not at all. And thank you for fighting through that, and really appreciate the specific details and the context here that you brought to bear. And I'll also add, I Don't Know More as well takes similar positions on Palestine as does BLM. So thank you for bringing that up, Desmond.
These are really hard questions. Maybe just to pick up on what Yara was just saying about overlapping systems of oppression. I guess the Combahee River Collective would say interlocking systems of oppression. Like, I think it is about allowing for things to be complicated, maybe in a way, so that, for example, I am in Canada, so-called, but we as Black peoples in Canada have a number of different pathways to have been arriving in this place. We are not one thing inside of Canada, but also our existence as Black people on these stolen territories is really informed by what happened even before we got here. So when I read people like Erica and her work and talking about Terra Nullius and how it applies, this erasure of Indigenous people and how it applies to what is still happening with our legal system today, it helps me to understand my place specifically as not just, people use the term African Canadian. I don't really like that. I like to think of myself as Black, but as a Black person, as Black people on stolen Indigenous territories in this part of the world, it makes things rich and complex. I see the way that people have coined and expanded the use of the term Israeli apartheid, and how I didn't actually understand this language at first. And I didn't understand why people were using a term that I understood to be applied to the South African struggle. And it took me a long time of listening to Palestinian people to understand why they have decided to use and expand this term in their own context. The idea that there are all kinds of different people within Palestine who are struggling against the Israeli settler colonial regime. There are Black Palestinian people who are living and engaging in that struggle every day. There are Black Jewish people who, although Israel is said to be a Jewish state, don't have the recognition and equal right and opportunity as Jews inside of that state. I think all of these things are about allowing for complexity, because the as I guess bell hooks would call them, the dominator culture forces that we're fighting against actually ask us to pit ourselves against one another, actually tell us that we should be arguing about whether Black people have it worse than Indigenous people, whether or not Black women are the most oppressed among women, and to turn our attention and our energies towards each other, rather than allowing for complexity that then lets us unite. And I think that's why I use things like Israeli apartheid, because I think that that's a unification of an understanding of struggle forged by different people in different places that we can all understand.
Thank you so much for that, Desmond, and a very important point on the complexities and the ways in which we're the way our energies are directed is not some just happenstance, and that it can serve power if we're not self-reflexive about how that happens. And I appreciate you bringing in the concrete example of Israeli apartheid into this discussion. Mohammed?
I want to begin by, I think everybody did an excellent job of getting at this. So I want to try to talk about what the other side is doing in terms of intersectionality. But first, I want to quote from an essay called, this is a very pivotal essay, called The Iron Wall by Ze'ev Jabotinsky. He's one of the pioneers of Zionism, and he's also one of the founders of the Irgun, the paramilitary, the Zionist militia responsible for the Deir Yassin massacre, for the bombing of the King David Hotel, and so on and so forth. This is an essay titled The Iron Wall, Colonization of Palestine, Agreement with Arabs, Impossible, Zionism must go forward, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, he gets, it's an excellent read. I advise everyone to read it, but he says, at some point, he says, the native populations, civilized or uncivilized, have always stubbornly resisted the colonists, irrespective of whether they were civilized or savage. And it made no difference whatsoever whether the colonists behaved decently or not. The companions of Cortes and Pizarro, or as some people will remind us, our own ancestors under Joshua bin Nun, behaved like brigands. But the Pilgrim Fathers, the first real pioneers of North America, were people of the highest morality who did not want to harm anyone, least of all the Red Indians. And they honestly believed that there was room enough in the prairies both for the paleface and the redskin. Yet the native population fought with the same ferocity against the good colonists as against the bad. So this is what Zionists think of Native Americans, of indigenous people. And yet, for the past decades, they have been forging alliances with Native communities. Israel and the Israeli Consulate General has been funding community centers in Indian reservations, right? And this goes the same, despite the fact that Israeli police trains American police in police brutality tactics. And I'm in no way saying that American police has not historically been racist, but Israeli police training has made it even more racist in mass surveillance tactics and police brutality tactics. They taught them the knee on neck technique, which famously killed the late George Floyd, right? Despite all of these trainings taking place, the Israeli regime is still investing in Black communities. There is still a push in evangelical churches for Black Zionism. This is happening. And it's alarming to me because it feels sometimes, and I apologize, I swear I'm not a killjoy, but this comes after all of the wonderful things everybody else has said. But I'm often worried that we only have an identitarian framework to work with in terms of honing our solidarity, and that the real connections between our communities have been getting more and more scarce as with the rise of neoliberalization, as Yara said, but also because we lack the resources. And also we lack the strategizing necessary, and power is what prevails. And you have actors like the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you have actors like the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs, forge these kinds of connections that can become more and more alarming. So I honestly do not have an answer to this question, but I have now for myself an even bigger question, is that how can we transform this identitarian solidarity, the solidarity that relies on good sentiment, into a systemized form of solidarity? Because not all Palestinians are politically involved. It's only a handful of us. All Palestinians are politicized inherently, but not all of us are politically involved. Not all of us are on the front lines. Not all of us are in the newspapers. So how can we transform this sentiment, this good sentiment that we all share, into like a political education, a political consciousness that can shape the ways we approach our, Black brothers and sisters, or indigenous indigenous brothers and sisters. And I say this, I don't want to go on too long, and to say nothing also of like the anti-Blackness that exists within our own communities that needs to be addressed, right? It's a very interesting topic, and I think it needs 2 hours on its own. And I just wanna again, not to be a killjoy, but I just want to shift our focus into the materiality of things rather than the identity.
Absolutely. No, not a killjoy at all. These are all critical questions, and in fact speak to what Ronaldo talked earlier about we need to have these deep conversations that are going to be uncomfortable, that are going to be difficult, that are going to be honest with each other. These are critical moving forward, and you're absolutely right. That is a topic on its own that could take up multiple hours and multiple meetings. And that's what it will take, in fact, to materialize it in more concrete ways, or in more systematic ways, as you put it. Okay, so I want to now switch to the another area, which is kind of like an area that I find as a kind of a source of awe and inspiration, and I think it's captured here in a quote from Yara in a 2022 piece that she wrote for Al Jazeera. Yara, you were writing about the murder of the Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh by Israeli forces, which happened just a little over a year ago, and you end the piece with this quote, and I quote. Independent investigations, in quotations, conducted merely to create the appearance that something is being done will deliver justice neither for Shireen nor for the thousands of Palestinians killed before her. Of that much we can be sure. But justice will come, and it will be Palestinians themselves that will ensure that it does. Today we mourn, and tomorrow we pick up the pieces of our struggle once again, end quote. And when we're talking about Black, Indigenous, and Palestinian struggles for peace and justice and liberation, we're talking about struggles that have been going on for quite some time. And of course, it is normal for these struggles to go through peaks and valleys, especially when they're as long as the ones that we're talking about. But we always do seem to pick up the pieces and continue on, as Yara mentions. You know, perhaps Yara and others, you can speak to this kind of commitment to the struggle that we find in all of these struggles, because again, it is something that you know, we shouldn't take for granted. But to me, it's quite an amazing thing that people, despite all the odds, despite all the immense power structures that they face, keep going and hang on to their cause of justice and peace. Yara, if you can start us off on that, please.
So I think when I wrote that piece, I wrote it to convince myself, to give myself hope. I was in Ramallah when they brought Shireen's body from Jenin, the place where she was assassinated, to Ramallah, to her place of work, and we gathered outside the Al Jazeera office out of respect, but also out of shock. And I think I needed to see her body, but also I needed to be with my comrades in the streets. And I'm not sure that when I wrote, to be very honest, today we mourn and tomorrow we pick up the pieces of our struggle once again, I'm not sure that I believed it then. But I can say that today is a good day, despite having a cold. And it's a good day because we're celebrating the work of Mohammed and, you know, all of our collective struggles. And I would say that I do believe in it today. And, you know, there is a reason why it's called a struggle, because it's not something that's easy. You know, this is generational work. We struggle not only for ourselves, but for those who are coming after us. And I think sometimes that's difficult to come to terms with. Certainly when I was younger, it was. The fact that we might not have liberation in our lifetime, that's a really difficult concept. And I think it's, you know, certainly one of the contributing factors as to why the Palestinian leadership throughout history has conceded on so much. It's, you know, they've really resorted to a desperation to see any kind of liberation, even if it's a little sliver, even if it's not really liberation, but just a facade. And it's not easy, you know, to stay on this path of complete liberation. And by complete, I'm talking not just geographically, but also socially, politically, economically. And all liberation struggles, you see people conceding along the way. You know, you see people saying, oh, we don't need economic independence. Oh, women don't need to be free. We'll deal with those things after. But the kind of justice and liberation we have been talking about tonight is really a long-term project. It's actually one that never ends. It's a generational commitment to a better life, to a better world. And I think it's a commitment that permeates all aspects of one's life. You know, the struggle of justice and liberation is actually a way of living. And that's why I also think it can be so exhausting. But I read something recently from the feminist Italian scholar Silvia Federici, which I think really helped me overcome this feeling of like being overwhelmed by this lifelong commitment to struggle. And she writes about finding joy in politics as a way to counter the inevitable sadness that accompanies such a commitment. And she writes, "Joyful politics is politics that changes your life for the better already in the present. This is not to deny that political engagement often involves suffering. In fact, our political involvement often is born of suffering. But the joy is knowing and deciding that we can do something about it. It is recognizing that we share our pain with other people. It is feeling the solidarity of those around us." And I think those words are incredibly poignant and useful to those of us who are committed to this kind of lifelong struggle.
Thank you, Yara. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Desmond.
Wow, that was very powerful, Yara. Thank you so much. And like, we should also say rest in peace to Shireen Abu Akleh and to all of the journalists who have been murdered, trying to show the rest of the world the atrocities and open our eyes to what's happening inside of occupied Palestine. I think that actually Mohammed, in his comments and in the work that he does, that you do, Mohammed, that you really embody a spirit of the reason that I think we carry on, which is a combination of love and defiance. You know, it's like a part of me is like, it's middle fingers up. You know, if I'm going to die in this struggle, I'm going to die with my middle fingers up, because like, we didn't ask for this. We didn't ask for this struggle. We were thrust into this struggle, and we have no option if we're going to live but to resist in some way, even if it's not in the political. Like, I appreciate Mohammed saying before that not all of us are politicized, not all of us are part of the movement, capital M, whatever that is. We are subject, though, to the same forces, whether we choose to organize and to participate or not. So like, part of it for me is that I want to give a middle finger to the structures and the forces that force us to waste so much of our lives trying to claw and to fight and to stay with our neck above, our head above the water. It's also love, though. I write in my own book about this moment that changed my life, which was a demonstration for a man by the name of Andrew Loku. Andrew was a 45-year-old Black immigrant living in Toronto who was murdered by a Toronto police officer named Andrew Doyle in July of 2015. And the Black Lives Matter movement was very much in its upswing in Canada. We had a group, Black Lives Matter Toronto, that was very active at that time, really doing a lot of organizing and challenging state power. And they did a demonstration for Andrew on Eglinton Avenue West, very close to his apartment where he was killed. And that was significant in and of itself, because most demonstrations that happen in Toronto of any real size happen downtown. They happen along University Avenue or Bay Street or Yonge Street, close to the consulate buildings, the political seats of power at City Hall or the courthouses and these kind of things. And very rarely did these kinds of bigger demonstrations leave the downtown core. This one was outside of the downtown core. It was where Andrew lived, and it was where a lot of Black people have traditionally lived for many decades in Toronto. A lot of them are being forced out now by gentrification. But it was the moment that after we had the speeches and the rallies and the tears at a park for Andrew, and we started marching, and we're marching down Eglinton Avenue West. And all of these Black people who live there and who have businesses there are seeing this march and knowing immediately what it's about. And people are coming out of their houses. People are coming out of their stores. People who are driving, who are getting stopped by the march, are coming out of their cars and hugging and high-fiving the demonstrators who are marching. it changed my life. I'm getting messed up just talking about it because we were seeing each other in that moment, and that was about love. And I think that is the other thing, really, outside of defiance, the major thing that propels us is the desire to honor. I'm just going to stop there. I hope what I'm saying is clear, but yeah.
Absolutely clear. And Desmond, being emotional is absolutely fine and acceptable in this space, just to be clear. And rest in peace to Andrew. And I hope everyone keeps in their hearts the words of love and defiance here coming out of that. Thank you for that. Erica. If you need a moment, I can come back to you. Yeah. Okay. Mohammed.
Thank you for that, Desmond. This is like a really hard question because it really depends on the day. But most of the time, if it's not love nor defiance, it's an obligation. We don't get to choose. We don't get to choose not to resist. We just do not have that option. So many of us here, millions of us, continue to live besieged, continue to live. The conditions we live in are insane. They're so bizarre. They're so insane. And they have been going on for 75 years. There's an entire population of us kept in a cage. And, you know, even if liberation is not happening in my lifetime or in my generation, I refuse to let that be my reality every day. I refuse to just consider. It is an act of refusal. I wrote just recently an essay in The Nation about the Nakba, and I said that Palestinian people are so amazing at conjuring a reality in which we are free, in which we do not subscribe to the status quo. You can build those borders, you can build these military outposts, you can build these checkpoints, but they don't, their meaning does not extend beyond the material cement, right? They can change the names of the cities, the names of the streets. They can tell us we're West Bankers and 48ers and Gazans. They can say whatever, we can write it into law. They can write it on the map. They can pressure Google to remove our names from their maps or whatever they want to do. But it's not going to change how we see our lives, how we see our reality, how we defy fragmentation. And I know this sounds very, romantic, and I know, and I'm sure it's riddled with challenges. And I'm sure so many of us have political challenges that they face. But at the same time, it is an act of refusal. It's an act of saying, okay, you can build the wall, and I'm still going to jump over it. And for me, as a person who is privileged enough, in a sense, to be given a platform time and time again, to be received and listened to, despite the smear campaigns, it would be selfish of me not to do this, despite how much I hate it some days, despite how much I don't want to be doing this. I have been talking to racist politicians and diplomats since I was 11 years old with broken English. I don't want to be doing this. Most days I don't want to be doing this, but it is my obligation. It's the role that I have to play, and I'll get a therapist later. Thanks.
Thank you, Mohammed. And I was there at an online event where you talked to a couple of racist politicians in Canada. That I kind of lost it on them a little bit after you and the speaker from Gaza signed off because they were disgusting. But anyway, we won't get into that here. Ronaldo.
All of my colleagues have been so eloquent on this question. But the question really made me think about Bob Marley's song, Redemption Song. The killing of prophets, the killing of people. But I guess one way that I want to come to this outside of that is to say that, all of this language of investigation, of independent investigation, all the way to, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, are really practices and institutions and even ideologies that are meant to cover up the very violence that they claim that they're investigating. And to do that, these institutions also have to inflict other kinds of violences. So they have to, like, you know, the Declaration, Universal Declaration of Human Rights has to pretend like there wasn't a long fight for the end of slavery. It has to pretend like, you know, the UN is an institution, and the Declaration of Human Rights emerges out of a very particular historical moment. And as it does that, it enacts other kinds of violences, and it creates the conditions for other kinds of violences to proceed as though they're the natural way of doing things. So for me, part of our work and part of what we want to do is we want to bring to an end Euro-American understanding of what a life should be. Because it is, in fact, Euro-American understanding of what they think a life should be that has many of us in captivity. In the literal material captivity that Mohammed is talking about in Gaza and elsewhere. And for those of us in this part of North America where we might think we can walk the streets, that we're enacting a particular kind of freedom, it's a different kind of captivity. And so, you know, the kind of, I like the Mohammed's notion of, I'm down with Mohammed's notion of it's an obligation. That, you know, we fight because we must, but we also fight because we come from histories where we know our fighting actually does something. It changes things, it transforms things. And this is why in this particular historical moment, the right wing, the Zionists, the ultra-white response has taken these tremendous levels of violence because they know that we come from long traditions of struggle that literally changes things materially and ideologically. And this is why I said earlier that we're also in a struggle for meaning. We're in a struggle for the meaning around what justice will be. We're in a struggle for meaning around what the state can do and mean. We're in a struggle for meaning around what nation means, around what land means, around what autonomy means. And we have to bring all of our forces, whether it's poetry, music, film, political speech, all of these things have to be on the table as we struggle to produce meanings that might lead to something called liberation.
Beautifully said there, Ronaldo, and very powerful. And I'll add, we need to talk about what peace should mean as well, in addition to all those terms. Erica.
Yeah, this is such a good conversation. Everyone is so is aiming toward like the same thing that I'm thinking of. So it's really beautiful. I think to take off on Ronaldo's point about they know that we come from a long tradition of resistance and like a continued resistance and continued refusal, not even in the sense of reaction, but in the sense of just the way we live being so different from the oppression that they're putting on us. So even when we were talking about the movements and the Idle No More movement and the Black Lives Matter movement and sort of the difficulties of reconciling, I hate that word, the difficulties of working with that as a movement, like the capital M movement versus the movements, right, lowercase, that we're really aiming toward. So thinking of liberation, like what is liberation an end? Do we get to liberation, or is it something that we live and constantly have to be not struggling towards, but enacting? Because I think that there's life beyond struggle, but I don't think that there's life beyond, like, I don't think we get to a point where we're liberated and that's it. I think that it's a constant ongoing thing. So Mohammed was saying, Yara said today is a good day, which I thought was like so poignant. And then Mohammed replied like that just the idea that today is a good day, and we're not reducible to our struggle. We're able to find beauty and strength in moments, both like historical and present. And that's our humanity, that's our personhood, that's our beyond humanity, that's our right as living breathing bodies moving through the world, humans, people moving through the world. Oh, English language. I want to introduce a little disruption here about the idea of origins. I thought we were sort of talking about like indigeneity and how basically like, I think so often people say, oh, Indigenous people shouldn't be homeless on their own homelands. And I hate that because it's like, no one should be homeless. Nobody should be dispossessed. Nobody should be, it has nothing to do with origins. And then my mind came to a Dion Brand quote. I think it's in Dion Brand's book that everyone cites constantly. I can't remember right now, that I read 500 times. But she says too much has been made of origins. And I think that's important to sort of consider as we're thinking about movement. I am not only my origins as a Native person, like a Native person to Saskatchewan or the prairies. And I think that clinging to those origins is important, not clinging, I shouldn't say clinging. Considering those origins and knowing where you're from is so beautiful and important, but our lives are so much more than that. Our lives are our movements. Our lives are our continued resistance, our continued joy, continually enacting beauty and freedom and liberation. An aesthetic definition of home, or like where you're from or where you're trying to return to or what we're trying to get back to, I don't know if it's that productive. Because maybe I don't want to return. If I don't, like, say I don't want to return to probably the sexism that existed pre-colonization. Like I don't need to return to anything because we have a future that is so much better than like anything we can imagine that I see coming.
Thank you so much for that, Erica. And that's, I mean, this point on origin and indigeneity could be another panel discussion just on its own. So, but that's a very critical point. So I see that we're out of time. However, the majority of the people are still listening. If the speakers are okay, can we do quick 10 minutes for the very last question? Or I know you have other schedules, but yeah, okay. So maybe just 2 minutes each very quickly for the very last question. And thank you for the audience for sticking around. But that shows you the quality of the discussion from our speakers is quite high. So, okay, so let's end with this. Desmond, in the preface of the paperback edition of your book, The Skin We're In, you refer to the events of the spring of 2022 when, and I quote from your book, Black people ignited a global resurgence of resistance, organizing, education, and political mobilization, end quote, sparked, of course, by the brutal murder, and as you call it, rightly call it, the lynching of George Floyd by Minneapolis police. In reference to those events, you write, and I quote, recent events are not evidence of so-called tipping point, but rather the cumulative and ongoing struggle of people forcing our elites to reckon with their crimes against people and the planet. Calls to abolish the police, prisons, and all systems of harm are not new and will not simply take hold because of a new mainstream recognition, end quote. So my last question, and it's related to the question that we just had, so that's why you can probably be brief in a quick 2-minute answer because you've already addressed some of this, but what does that road to an anti-racist, decolonial liberation look like for those people who are oppressed, exploited, terrorized, and brutalized under the structural violences of colonial modernity? In other words, how do we move away from, as Desmond puts it, the systems that harm us? And how do we gain liberation, not through those systems, but despite those systems? So we'll start with that, Desmond, and we'll make sure that Mohammed, as is fitting today, gets the final word in our discussion. So Desmond.
Well, thank you to everybody for this amazing, amazing discussion today. Thank you for those who stayed to listen too. I think this is why I brought up Dion Brand, as we almost all of us have some point in this conversation earlier about justice, because it's like when we formulate the idea of justice a lot of the time, it's asking the same system as Ronaldo was alluding to earlier that has harmed us to then turn around and say, you know what, we were wrong actually about that. We messed up. Now we're like, what does justice look like for example, someone who's been taken away from us by the state? Like, what would justice mean in that case? How do we restore and repair that? I don't know. but I do think that the kind of gradual transformation, as Erica just so beautifully said, to like a far better future than we can imagine that we're experiencing now. That's what I believe we are trying to do right now. Just as one example, kind of related to that quote, we're saying abolish the police, and it's like madness. Like, what do you mean abolish the police? Like, how? Who will teach Black people to be civil and orderly in public if there's not this like overseer always threatening to hurt us, right? How will the society in general be orderly if there's no threat of violence? And we don't have the answer, but we just know it can't keep going like this. So for me, I think it is about demanding more than what the current system prescribes as possible for us. I think like that's really a key, is not setting our expectation necessarily based on what is allowed. And that's tricky, because when you're trying to do concrete things in the world, you want to give people hope that the action that they're taking can create a tangible outcome. You don't want to just say world peace now, and that's our slogan for everything. World peace right now. Great. You want to have something that people can hold on to, that people can specifically in their own community work towards and see. In the case of the struggle that we're speaking about today, I think that's what the BDS movement is. I think BDS is a way of concretely saying, here's how we begin to harm and take down and delegitimize this power structure that is oppressing Palestinian people. There's concrete things that we can do, right? And so I think we have to balance between the concrete campaigning of day to day and taking actions that are specific to the structures of power, but also daring to go way beyond that to projects that, as others have said on this panel, are not going to be realized in our lifetime, but are still important to aspire to. So it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
And thank you for those excellent closing comments from your end, Desmond. I think it leaves people with something concrete to hold on to as well there. Erica.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. Thank you for your contributions, your generosity, your thoughtfulness, and thank you for leading us in this discussion and bringing us together. I find that events so often in the work that we do, I know that all of us have similar kind of lives in doing this work, survival work, liberation work, whatever you want to call it. Like we never, our work is not done after a 9 to 5. And as people who deal with oppression, who live with oppression. So, and these topics are so intimately connected to who we are as people and our lives, which is, I think, the most genuine and powerful position to have. We're not talking about the abstract. We're talking about concrete, the material, what it is to make our lives better, what will make the lives of our loved ones and the people we'll never meet better, just to make life better, period. And your commitment to that makes me feel stronger. It makes me happy that these conversations happen, but I know they're so often ephemeral and they feel so like one-off, and then we're done. Like, okay, we solved liberation in an hour or two, and now we just go our own separate ways. And I'm tired of that happening. So I appreciate that we're considering this as one conversation on a longer path. And I hope that everyone is into that idea, right? Like there's no nice, tidy ending to this. Like Desmond said, like things are messy. Life is messy. Life is absurd often. So, but the stakes are our lives. The stakes are our liberation. The stakes are our happiness and our joy. And something so far beyond like the cops and borders and all of this crap that we're dealing with that Mohammed is really deserving of this award for, as optics or not, let's celebrate you. So it's such a joy to meet you.
Thank you for those comments, Erica. I really appreciate it. And again, very inspirational and powerful for people to keep these conversations going in their own spheres as well. You don't have to wait for a panel like this to have these conversations for our listeners. You can have those conversations with your networks and the people around you on a day-to-day basis over dinner and what have you. So please keep those going. Yara.
I'll keep it short. But I just wanted to say thank you to all of you for sharing tonight. I think one of the aspects that are not talked about often to struggles is the friendships and bonds that we make with our comrades. So I appreciate the space. I think, in a nutshell, decolonization is quite simply the undoing of colonial rule. And sadly, or rather predictably, when decolonization is talked about in mainstream spaces, mainstream Western spaces, it usually isn't about decolonization at all. It's become this kind of buzzword. You decolonize the curriculum, you decolonize schools, you decolonize your aunt. It becomes devoid of true meaning. And I think, if we think about decolonization as this, repatriation of indigenous life and land, we insist that decolonization is not simply about making things more equitable. It has a much deeper meaning than that, and it has a meaning which is disruptive and uncomfortable. And obviously, I think decolonization means different things in different contexts, and I can only hope to speak to the Palestinian ones. But I can't give you an exact idea of what it will look like in Palestine. I think we actually have to have, as a people, a collective vision for that process. But it is, precisely that, a process, and it's not an easy one, a comfortable one. But crucially, I think that, Palestinians have to be at the heart of that process. And it's not about romanticizing the past. I think a lot of Palestinians have a tendency to think about decolonization as a return to pre-1948 Palestine. We can't do that for several reasons. Time has moved on, but we also don't want to go back to that time. We don't want to reinforce power structures that existed pre-1948. Feudalism, lands being held in the hands of the wealthy, and noble families, the subjugation of women, etc. So my point is that this vision for a decolonized future, I think, is yet to be determined by Palestinians, and I think that's okay. The blueprint doesn't have to be set in stone, but I think for that process to begin, we have to know where to start. And in the case of Palestine, the obvious answer is dismantling the Zionist apartheid regime that has robbed us and continues to rob us of our future.
Very powerfully said again, Yara. Thank you. Ronaldo.
Yes, I want to echo my colleagues by saying it's been an absolute honor to be in your company, Mohammed. You might be much younger than me, but you are an inspirator. And I mean that sincerely, and people who know me know that I wouldn't usually say something like that in public if I didn't truly mean it. We are in a significant and major and ongoing struggle to bring to an end what European expansion post-Columbus has unleashed on this earth. That's our strike. That's our fight. We want to bring Euro-American humanism to its end. If we can't do that, we cannot ever create the conditions for new forms of social life to emerge, for us to begin to really seriously figure out how we can live collectively better together, right? And so what's at stake is ending what European humanism have unleashed on all of us across this globe, where Europe has decided that its understanding of what it means to live a life is the only understanding that we should have. And what that means is then that the majority of us fail at actually being able to live the lives that we want to live, because Europe's violence keeps us locked into Europe's humanism. So for me, I see my work as joining this long multi-generational struggle where I know that the things that I really desire will not manifest themselves today, next week, or next year, or even in my lifetime. But I'm committed to helping to build the small foundations towards something else, towards something more livable, towards something that is not captive to Euro-American humanism. So thank you guys for having me be a part of this conversation today.
Thank you so much, Ronaldo. And that puts it perfectly in the larger historical context of what we're really talking about here. And really like the revolutionary, transformative aspect of what we're discussing here. And last but certainly not least, our esteemed guest tonight, Mohammed El-Kurd.
Thank you so much. I want to warn you, I'm about to attempt to be earnest for like 30 seconds. So bear with me. I'm very, very appreciative of all of the kind words, and it's honestly so heartwarming to be in your presence and to engage in this conversation with you, and to have it not be just like a conversation of platitudes, but really a critical conversation. And thank you. I think this is the most I can do in terms of earnestness. Now, to answer the question, in terms of the material answer, I agree with specifically everything Yara said in regards to the Palestinian liberation question, and more broadly with everything everybody else said. But absolutely, our liberation struggle must be rooted in a class consciousness, in a feminist framework. But I wanna just, because I've been straying away from the abstract, I want to end on an abstract note. I think we are at an unprecedented moment for Palestine. We have an openness, if not an eagerness, to engage in the Palestinian liberation movement, and it would be foolish of us not to change our strategy, not to be more offensive, not to be more forthcoming and unabashed as we have been in the past years. It sometimes feels like we are in a pandemic of indignity, sometimes, but especially when we are doing advocacy, we turn the other cheek, we burden our children with the task of convincing politicians of their humanity. We lower the bar and we treat our right to self-defense, to resistance, to freedom as somehow debatable. So I want myself and all of us and everybody watching to always renew our commitment to dignity and self-respect. Such a commitment certainly tips the power scale, be it in the face of a racist interview question, or in the face of a soldier, or in the face of a skeptical academic. It is truly about dignity in the struggle, and the Palestinian people, the Black liberation struggle, the indigenous struggle have shown us amazing examples in which dignity and self-respect and standing up tall have resulted in amazing things, in amazing freedoms. So we are, I don't know the expression, but I think we are on fertile ground for change, and we really need to seize the moment. And again, thank you so much for having me, and for taking time out of your day to engage in this conversation. And thank you, Ara. I know you're so sick, so I hope you get better. Yeah.
Thank you so much for those inspirational and beautiful words, Mohammed. And now I just want to thank everyone for attending. I want to thank our wonderful speakers here. It's an honor of mine to have known you and work with you. Some of you I've known for a little longer than others. Some of you I just met. But it's been a real honor to work with you on this, and I look forward to continuing to do that in the future. And most of all, of course, I want to thank Mohammed for accepting the Peace Prize as well. I cannot think of someone more deserving for the 2023 Calgary Peace Prize than Mohammed El-Kurd. This has been an unbelievable conversation, and these conversations are rare, and that's why the majority of people stick around for almost 2.5 hours, which is quite rare. So thank you all very much, and look forward to seeing you in the future at other events, and hopefully at another Calgary Peace Prize as well. Thank you. I'll end it here.